You wake up to an alarm. You check a phone before your feet hit the floor. You commute. You sit. You type. You scroll. And somewhere around hour 8 you wonder if this is just what being human means now. But the real answer is far stranger. For most of the time humans have existed, nobody worked an 8-hour day. Nobody had a boss. Nobody had a Sunday that felt different from a Tuesday. And yet they survived, for hundreds of thousands of years, doing something that looked almost nothing like what you call work today. So what did they actually do, hour by hour from sunrise to sunset? Picture it for a moment. No clock on the wall. No calendar with deadlines circled in red. Just light, and the absence of light, and a body that knows when it's hungry. That's the entire schedule. It sounds impossible to modern ears. How does anyone get anything done without a structure forcing them to? In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee decided to find out. He didn't guess. He didn't theorize from an armchair. He traveled to the Kalahari Desert and lived among the hoansi, a hunting and gathering people whose way of life had barely changed in generations. He followed them. He timed them. He counted every hour they spent finding food. His numbers stunned the academic world. Adults in the camp spent somewhere between 12 and 19 hours a week getting food. That's it. Less than 3 hours a day. The rest of their time went to resting, talking, making tools, telling stories, and doing what most modern humans would simply call living. Lee even tracked the hardest worker in the entire camp, a man who went hunting on 16 of 28 days straight. Even he topped out at around 32 hours a week spent on the food quest. That's still less than most people spend at a desk job, and he was the outlier, not the average. Lee published his findings, and a fellow anthropologist named Marshall Sahlins ran with them. Sahlins called it the original affluent society. Not affluent because these people had more stuff. Affluent because they wanted less, and got it easily. Where modern wealth comes from producing more, Sahlins argued. Forager wealth came from desiring little and meeting that desire fast. It's a strange kind of richness. Could having fewer wants actually make you wealthier than having more things? Sahlins pointed out something else too. Foragers didn't just have free time. They actively chose not to use all of their economic potential. They could have hunted more, gathered more, stockpiled more. They didn't. Once a band had enough food for the day, they stopped. There was no instinct to accumulate beyond need, because need was the entire point. Compare that to a modern economy built almost entirely around growth, around always wanting more revenue than last quarter, more output than last year. The forager model and the modern model aren't just different, they're nearly opposite now. Here's the twist. Lee's original number didn't include everything. It only counted time spent actively hunting or gathering out in the bush. It left out food preparation. It left out tool repair. It left out carrying water, nursing children, and the dozens of small tasks that happened back at camp. When Lee redid his math years later, factoring in this hidden labor, the number climbed closer to 40 hours a week. Suddenly the picture looked a lot more familiar, so which version is true? Both. In a way, it depends entirely on what you count as work. More recent research has tried to settle the question with better tools. A team led by anthropologist Mark Dyble spent 2 years living with the Agta, a community of hunter-gatherers in the northern Philippines. Instead of relying on memory or rough estimates, his team checked in on real people at regular intervals. Every single day, from morning until evening, they logged what hundreds of individuals were doing in that exact moment: hunting, gathering, childcare, cooking, resting, talking. The result was the clearest time used picture science has ever produced for a foraging society. Agta adults spent about 24 hours a week on tasks outside camp, hunting or gathering. They spent roughly 20 more hours a week on domestic chores back at camp. And after all of that, they still had about 30 hours of pure daylight leisure time left over every week. 30 hours of nothing they were obligated to do. Think about what fills those 30 hours. Storytelling around a fire, grooming and conversation, children weaving in and out of adult activities, never quite separated from the grown-up world the way modern children are. Naps, taken without guilt, in the middle of the day. None of it produced anything you could measure on a balance sheet, and all of it was, by Dyble's own account, just as essential to forager life as the hunting itself. Compare that to your own week. How many hours of true, unscheduled daylight leisure do you actually get? What's even more revealing is what happened when some of these same communities switched to farming. You might assume agriculture made life easier. Plant a seed, harvest a crop, problem solved forever. But Dyble's research found the opposite. Hunter-gatherers who took up farming worked about 10 hours a week longer than their foraging neighbors. Farming didn't buy back time. It spent more of it, in exchange for a more predictable, storable harvest. The trade wasn't laziness versus hard work. It was unpredictability versus exhaustion, and every society had to choose which one to live with. And this wasn't only an adult arrangement. Among hunting and gathering peoples like the Hadza of Tanzania, children weren't shuttled into classrooms to learn in the abstract. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe documented how Hadza children, some as young as 5, foraged using small bows and digging sticks shaped just for their hands. Their play and their work were the same activity, just viewed from 2 different angles. A child mimicking how dad strips bark from a tree wasn't avoiding chores. They were rehearsing the exact skill that would keep them fed for the rest of their life. There was no separation between learning, working, and playing. Today you draw careful lines between school, job, and hobby, as if they're 3 different rooms in a house. For most of human history, it was one room. So if forager life had this much breathing room, why did so many societies eventually trade it away for agriculture, for cities, for the 8-hour day? Part of the answer is risk. A forager's 30 hours of leisure came at a price: unpredictability, a bad season, a drought, a missed migration of game, and that abundance could vanish fast. Farming offered something foragers rarely had: storage. A granary full of grain doesn't care if it rains next week. That security was worth the extra 10 hours a week to a lot of people, even if it meant grinding labor their forager ancestors never knew. There's also a population piece to this puzzle. Agriculture could feed far more people per acre than foraging ever could. More food meant more children survived. More children meant more hands needed for more labor. Within a few generations, the relaxed rhythm Sahlins described had been replaced by something closer to a treadmill, one that just kept accelerating as villages became towns, and towns became cities. By the time you reached the Industrial Revolution, something else had changed entirely: the clock itself. Foragers worked, in Sahlins' words, until they had enough, then stopped. There was no fixed shift, no punch card, no manager checking if you'd put in your hours. Industrial labor introduced a different idea completely. Time itself, measured in identical units, became the thing you sold. Not your harvest, not your catch, your hours. That idea is so deeply embedded in modern life that it's almost invisible. You don't ask, did I gather enough today? You ask, did I work enough hours today? The entire unit of measurement changed, and almost nobody alive today remembers a world where it was any different. Factories needed something foraging never required: synchronization. A loom doesn't run itself. A shift only works if everyone shows up at the same time and leaves at the same time. So the workday stopped bending around hunger, weather, or energy, and started bending around the machine's schedule instead. Humans adjusted to the rhythm of industry, not the other way around. It's worth sitting with that for a second. The system wasn't built for the body was retrofitted to fit the system. Here's what makes this stranger than it first sounds. The 40-hour workweek you live by wasn't designed around your biology, your attention span, or your need for rest. It was a labor negotiation, hammered out over a century of strikes and policy fights, mostly in the early 20th century. It is, in a very real sense, an accident of economic history, not a law of human nature. Meanwhile, the brain showing up to your office or your laptop every morning is, for all practical purposes, the same brain that belonged to a forager 12,000 years ago. It still expects variability. It still craves a mix of physical activity, social contact, and rest scattered through the day, rather than crammed into evenings and weekends. No wonder so many people describe modern work not as difficult, exactly, but as unnatural. This doesn't mean foraging life was some lost paradise. Sahlins' critics are right to point out the risks: higher infant mortality in many forager populations, exposure to extreme weather, no antibiotics, no hospitals. Nobody is suggesting you abandon your job and walk into the bush, but the comparison does something useful. It strips away the assumption that your current schedule is simply how humans are supposed to live. It isn't. It's one experiment among many, and a fairly recent one at that. Think about how recent it really is. Humans have existed in some form for roughly 300,000 years. The 8-hour 5-day workweek has existed for about a century. If you scaled all of human history down to a single 24-hour day, the modern workweek would occupy the final few seconds before midnight. Almost everything you assume about how work is supposed to feel was invented in that last sliver of time. That's so. The next time you're staring at a clock, waiting for 5 o'clock to arrive, consider what that clock actually represents. Not a biological need, not an ancestral rhythm passed down for hundreds of thousands of years, a relatively new invention. built to organize labor at a scale your ancestors never had to imagine. You wake up to an alarm, and you check a phone before your feet hit the floor. But somewhere underneath that routine is a much older brain, one that spent most of its existence working less, resting more, and never once needing a weekend to recover from a week that, for most of human history, simply didn't exist.